Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and visitors. It is my pleasure on behalf of the Abu Dhabi, NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, as well as the Gallup Center, Abu Dhabi Gallup Center, to welcome you to our program tonight. I think you will find it quite enlightening and rewarding. We have assembled a very distinguished panel to discuss the findings of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies and Abu Dhabi Gallup Center project entitled Muslim Americans, Faith, Freedom, and the Future, examining U.S. Muslims' political, social, and spiritual engagement 10 years after September 11. As you know, this is the 10th year that we are reflecting on the tragic events of September 11th. And for those of us who are Muslims, particularly who live in America, it has been a very trying and difficult time for us. However, what we've seen in terms of the latest study has given me personally a sense of optimism about the future. For the findings really assert that the Muslims are very optimistic about their future in the United States. As you know, there has been historically a kind of chasm that has existed between America and its Muslim population, kind of fed into by the kind of what we call the kind of historiography of Orientalist discourse that has created a kind of exoticized other, and a sequence or a cacophony of events that have taken place beginning early on with the Crusades all the way up into the Iranian Revolution. And these events have often shaped the contours of the relationship between America and its Muslim citizens. But by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this report gives us a new vision, a new sense of optimism and hope in terms of bridging the divide and bringing together these communities. I will begin by introducing Dalia Mogahed, who is the executive director of the Abu Dhabi Gallup Center, who has distinguished herself as a very extraordinary leader in developing empirical social research that really gives truth to the reality of what's happening on the ground, as opposed to much of the speculation. Without further ado, I would like to bring Sister Dalia to the front to make her presentation about the findings of the report. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everyone. I think I was reflecting on the news of the past 48 hours as I walked to this event today and thought about how today Tunisians, for the first time, had a free election. Of course, the news in Libya and the list goes on. The transformations that are going on in the region are unprecedented. And it made me wonder, it might seem awkward to be talking about Muslim Americans when there's so much to talk about in the region. But whereas people in this region are rediscovering their citizenship and perhaps even redefining what it means to be a citizen, in a much quieter way, Muslim Americans are really doing the same thing. This report is about Muslim Americans as citizens and what that means in a post-9/11 world. I'm going to start by giving you the answers. Here are the key findings. First, Muslim Americans are doing better. They are more hopeful today than they were in 2008. They are the most likely faith community in the United States to unequivocally say that it is never justified to deliberately target civilians. At the same time, though, they're the most likely faith community to express criticism of counter terrorism tactics in the United States. They express loyalty to their country, but at the same time face distrust from a significant minority of their fellow citizens. Their commitment to their faith is strong, and it's associated with positive emotional health and tolerance toward others. And finally, Muslim Americans, according to our research, are often the closest to Jewish Americans in their political and social views. So before we delve into the study, I just want to briefly talk about who are Muslim Americans. This community is often lumped in with a lot of different categories. We did a major study starting in 2008 where we called more than 365,000 American households at random, a random sample of more than 300,000 American households. But by doing that, we were able to collect more than 1,000 self-identified Muslim Americans, completely at random, without finding them using Muslim-sounding last names, where of course we wouldn't have been able to talk to someone like Keith Ellison, the first Muslim congressman. We found Muslim Americans by calling American households and simply collecting those respondents that identified as Muslims. And by doing that, by doing it in this completely random way, without any preconceived ideas of where we would find a Muslim, what they would look like, and what their names would be, we were able to create a national portrait of Muslim Americans. And what we found was that Muslim Americans, unique to all other American faith communities, have no majority race. They're not majority Arab, they're not majority South Asian, they're not majority white or black. The plurality, though, 35% of Muslim Americans are African American. That's actually the largest racial group of Muslim Americans. And the remainder are basically equally split between Arab, South Asian, and this other group that simply calls themselves other, a mixture of everything else. Muslim Americans are among the most likely in America to be educated, to be entrepreneurial, and they are disproportionately young as a faith community. And this group, this very diverse group of people, are today among the most likely to be classified as thriving, which is a measure Gallup has to reflect people's evaluation of their lives, both their lives today as well as their assessment of their lives in the future. So contrary to what we might expect with some of the many events that have happened between 2008 and 2011 in terms of the Ground Zero controversy and other things, Muslim Americans are actually quite optimistic. Now, what I thought was very interesting is what are the variables that predict thriving, a high life evaluation? The number one most powerful variable in predicting this sense of well-being is if someone has confidence in the FBI. And I think that's so significant because no other group has the FBI play such an important role in their well-being. It is only Muslim Americans where how they feel about the FBI actually affects their overall sense of well-being. The second variable that predicts well-being is if they attend a mosque or a religious service at least once a week. So religious practice in a community predicts a high sense of well-being, but also strongly identifying with the United States. So what this profile paints is someone who feels fully at home in America as a Muslim and doesn't think that they are being targeted by law enforcement. Now, rejection of terrorism is a major theme that we uncovered in our research. Muslim Americans are the most likely major US religious group to reject violent military or individual attacks on civilians. 78% of Muslim Americans say that military attacks on civilians are never justified, whereas 21% say that they can be sometimes justified. But when you compare that across, it's quite distinct. Muslim Americans are distinct in their views of the possibility of justifying military attacks on civilians when compared to other major religious groups in the United States. But when it comes to individual attacks, they're even more strongly against this unequivocally as never justified. 89% saying it's never justified for an individual to target and kill civilians. And that compares to roughly 70 to 79% across other faith communities. Despite this, though, despite this strong aversion to attacks on civilians, there is still a significant minority of their fellow Americans who do say that they aren't sure whether or not Muslim Americans sympathize with Al-Qaeda. So 92% of Muslims say that Muslim Americans do not sympathize with Al-Qaeda, whereas that percentage is a lot softer. That majority is a lot softer across other faith communities. Again, with Jewish and non-religious Americans, the most likely to also believe that Muslims do not identify or do not sympathize with terrorist organization. And that leads us to this concept, this idea: are Muslims therefore more obligated to speak out against terrorism? Should they be? Do they have really a commitment to saying loudly that they are in fact against terrorist acts? What I thought was very interesting is that among Muslim Americans themselves, it's split right down the middle. Half of Muslim Americans say no. It's not necessarily up to us to condemn terrorism every time it happens. We are no more associated with it, or we are no more obligated to speak out against it than anyone else. Whereas half say yes, we are more obligated and have to speak out louder than everyone else. And across the other faith communities, essentially, it's similar, especially among Protestants. Interestingly, among non-religious Americans who say they have no religion or no affiliation, they're even less likely than Muslim Americans to say that they shouldn't be obligated to speak out against terrorism any more than anyone else. Now the question is, do they in fact speak out enough? Muslim Americans, for the most part, believe that they do. Only 28% say it does not apply. But the rest of their fellow citizens pretty much don't feel that way. They don't think that Muslim Americans are loud enough in their objection, in their vocal objection to terrorism. Now, if we've established that indeed the sentiment publicly is that people are against terrorism, this would make Muslim Americans a natural partner or a natural ally in the war against violent extremism. Yet they are the most critical of the institutions and interventions that have been used in the so-called war on terror. So they were the most likely Americans to say the war in Iraq was a mistake. 83% said it was a mistake, whereas it's about half of other faith communities, with the exception, again, of Jewish Americans, which are the most likely to also think that the war in Iraq was a mistake. Muslim Americans are the most likely to see the U.S. actions as the reason for anti-American or negative perceptions of America globally. 26% say that it's based on simply misinformation of America, whereas 65%, the majority, say no, it's because of the actual actions of America in foreign lands that make people angry. That's not the case with everyone else. The vast majority of Americans of other faiths think that it's undeserved. It's about misinformation that causes people to hold negative views of the United States. So there is this disconnect on many aspects of how Muslim Americans view their country's foreign policy in comparison to Americans of other faiths. They also have the lowest, as a result, the lowest confidence in the US military. It's still quite high, 70% confidence, but significantly less so than the very, very high confidence that the US military enjoys among other Americans. And then when it comes to the FBI, 60% confidence compared to 75% or higher among other faith communities. So there is a lower sense that these institutions that are used in the war against terrorism are truly doing what they should be doing in the way that would be best to counter this common enemy we are calling violent extremism. And finally, when it comes to profiling, it's a very interesting set of data where we ask people, do you think it's possible to define the profile of a terrorist? Can we really tell, can we really profile a terrorist based on their ethnicity or their gender, their age, and their demographics? It's interesting because it's basically split. 44% of Protestants say no, we can't define a terrorist. 40% say yes, you can define a terrorist, and that person should be watched more closely. The remainder say yes, you can define them, but you shouldn't follow them more closely. Now, when it comes to Muslim Americans, the vast majority don't in fact believe that one can identify or profile a terrorist. Again, a disconnect, a difference in views on just the efficacy, the ability of profiling to really work. But all of these things have not taken away Muslim Americans' identification and loyalty and love for their country. First, we asked about identity, how people feel about different dimensions of their identity. And what I think is very important to keep in mind here is we didn't ask people to choose which identity that they are first. Are you first a Yankee fan or an American? I mean, it's a hard question to answer. We actually asked people to just tell us how strong each identity was independently. And then we're able to look at, does a strong national identity mean a weaker religious identity and vice versa or not? We can actually ask that question and answer it empirically. So here's what we found. People's identification with the United States in other faith communities is quite high, and then you can see the different strengths of their other identities, their ethnicity, their religion, and then those worldwide who share their religious identity. So their, quote, Ummah. Here's what it looks like for Muslim Americans. Muslim Americans are as likely to identify strongly with their country as their faith. Now, what I think is quite interesting is that other groups, like Protestants, like Mormons, actually identify much stronger than do Muslim Americans with their global faith community. Muslim Americans also believe in their country's democratic institutions. In fact, slightly more so than everyone else. These numbers might surprise some of us. This is the degree of confidence that Americans have in the honesty of their elections. Majority of Protestants don't think the elections are honest, which I always find surprising. 57% of Muslims do believe the elections are honest, and they are higher than other communities in America. They're also very enthusiastic and remain so about the president. So if you look at the numbers for 2008, and these are approval numbers across different faith communities, only 7% of Muslim Americans approved of President Bush. And that skyrocketed to 84% with President Obama. And they're pretty much, I can say, about the only faith community that has stuck it out with the president throughout this term, where they've been strong throughout, whereas everyone else has let the president, their enthusiasm has waned, shall we say, for President Obama. So, like I said, they are criticizing much of the tactics of the United States in its interaction with Muslims, but that isn't translating into a lack of love and loyalty for their country. It's also not translating into a sense of isolation from their fellow Americans. So we have this index that measures interreligious harmony or interreligious interaction. People can be classified into one of three categories: isolated, tolerant, which means live and let live, and then the highest level of interreligious engagement is integrated. And what that means is not only are you tolerant of others that are different from you, but you actually want to learn from them. You actually think that they enrich society. And 44% of Muslim Americans fall into this category, and this is the result of 5 questions about their interactions with others. And they tend to be among the highest in the United States to fall into this category. Now, when it comes to facing prejudice, roughly half of Americans of other faiths believe that Muslims do face a great deal of prejudice. Interestingly, Jewish Americans are slightly more likely than even Muslim Americans to see this as a problem. But despite that, 48%, roughly half of Muslim Americans, believe that they have experienced some level of discrimination based on their racial or religious background. Now, has this negativity made them feel that their community doesn't belong? The answer is no. 93% of Muslim Americans say that they see Muslim Americans, their community as a whole, as loyal to the country. Majorities of other communities also think that Muslim Americans are loyal, so that's important to keep in mind. But there is also a significant minority that doubts Muslim American loyalty. Again, interestingly, the group most likely to believe in Muslim American loyalty are Jewish Americans. Now, how does this all relate to Muslim Americans' spiritual engagement? Well, first, if you look at America's faith mosaic, Americans are actually among the most religious Western countries in the world. So these are the percentages of people who go to a religious service in different frequencies. And 43% of Protestants say that they go at least once a week, with Mormons actually at 66% say they at least go once a week to a religious service. Muslim Americans are very similar to Protestant Americans, actually, in their religious attendance. Now, this isn't always a perfect proxy for religiosity, of course, but it does give us a feel for the communal aspect of Muslim religious practice. What's interesting, though, is that those people, those Muslims who go to a religious service the most frequently, at least once a week, are less likely to say that they experienced anger. They're also less likely to say that they experienced stress. And this cuts across the board for all Americans. The people who attend church or temple or whatever religious service more frequently are also ones who experience fewer negative emotional experiences throughout their day. So, the experience of Muslim communal practice is associated with positive emotional well-being. The other thing it's associated with, which I find very interesting, is this. There's a lot of information here, so to kind of distill it. When we talked about this idea of being integrated, of interacting most positively with people of other faiths, here's what we found. People who are integrated, Muslim Americans who are integrated, who are the most engaged with people of other faiths, are most likely to say that they're willing to take an unpopular stand to defend their faith, and are the most likely to say that their faith plays a very important part in every aspect of their life. So having an engaged spiritual life actually is associated with greater interfaith engagement and harmony. And it's also associated with being brave enough or having the courage to take unpopular stands. And what that means is this, is that when people are standing up and defending their community or their faith, it's not out of isolation and it's not out of a lack of integration. It's actually, what this suggests, more out of a sense of trust that their community, if they hear them, will understand. If you are able to take the courage to speak out and take a stand that's unpopular, it actually means you trust those around you to be understanding. It's a sign of integration, not of isolation. But despite all of this, and this is the really surprising part, a faith in elections, a sense of interreligious engagement, Muslim Americans are the least likely to be registered to vote. So there is a gap between their enthusiasm for their democratic principles and their actual involvement in politics. One reason might be that, like I said before, Muslim Americans are on average much younger than Americans of other faiths. Young people do tend to vote less than older people, so that's one possible issue. But another issue is that there aren't national Muslim American organizations that a lot of people feel really represent them. And so a lack of strong representative institutions can be another obstacle to political integration. So what are our recommendations, very briefly? First, for government. There needs to be a systematic documentation to assess the degree of anti-Muslim discrimination in America. If close to half of Muslims are claiming that they've experienced it, we need to have better numbers on the reality of that. Is that happening or isn't it? And then we can move from there to figure out how to stop it. We'd also recommend that the US government engage and leverage Muslim Americans' expertise in the nation's foreign policy. They are among the most critical of our foreign policy, but also among the most dedicated to bringing about positive change. Now, civil society, this is not government. Our recommendation is to focus on the mosque or on community organizations as an important institution of Muslim American mobilization. And the reason we say that is because the frequency by which people go to a religious service is far higher than their identification with national organizations. It's also correlated with positive things like emotional well-being, but also higher degrees of interreligious harmony. And for civil society in the United States to increase opportunities for education and engagement in and among faith groups, and that's to address the significant minority that still is viewing their fellow Americans of Muslim faith with suspicion. Thank you.
What I'd like to do first is kind of start off with a conversation about what you do in terms of your own work in the community in the United States, starting with you, Sister Jamillah.
Thank you. I'll first say that I grew up in a very special community, an African-American Muslim community, Sunni community, but it had roots in the Nation of Islam. So my parents, for instance, initially came to Islam through the Nation of Islam, like Malcolm X, for instance. And so that experience certainly frames a lot of my research and the new directions that I'm going. As mentioned, I wrote a book on American Muslim women. The book largely is about relations between African American and South Asian immigrants, but I tell that story through the perspectives of women. And so I did my research right after 9/11, and I was able to witness the ways that American Muslim leaders were responding to the events around 9/11 and have much to do with the topics in the Gallup report. So I'd love to share some of my insights there. And lastly, I'd like to say that I'm really excited about, in the ways that I am, returning to my roots and researching the experiences of women who were in the Nation of Islam and women who are currently in the Nation of Islam. And I think it's going to shed further light on, again, what it means to be Muslim in America, and again, the directions for Islam in America.
Thank you very much, Sister Jamillah. Angela.
I'd like to begin by thanking Abu Dhabi Gallup poll and NYU Abu Dhabi, the Institute, for having this event and for inviting me. As Dr. Amir said, I'm an attorney from the United States. September 11th happened about 2 weeks after I started law school. Prior to that, I was an activist in the Arab American community, working largely, before 9/11, I think a lot of the activism, a lot of the community work was done on issues of foreign policy. So the struggle in Palestine, there was a lot of activism around the sanctions in Iraq. This is after the first war in Iraq. And then 2 weeks after I started law school, September 11th happened. And it really, I think, transformed the trajectory of a lot of people in the community and in the things that we worked on, because unfortunately the Arab American and Muslim American community was largely unprepared. I'm sure this will be familiar for many Arabs and Muslims in the room, that parents were not encouraging their daughters and their sons to go to law school. They wanted them to be doctors or engineers, something practical. And so when September 11th happened, there were very few Arab American and Muslim American lawyers or law students. And so after September 11th, I became very involved in working on issues of discrimination, civil rights issues. Initially as a student, we had so few lawyers in the community that law students were doing what they could within the bounds of the law to advocate for people who were having difficulty. And then thereafter, I became a civil rights attorney for several years. I worked in a private firm with 2 attorneys, including myself. The other attorney was the first Muslim and Arab, we call them human rights commissioners in New York City. These are people who are appointed by the mayor to basically review claims of discrimination. And so I spent several years as a civil rights attorney, working largely with the Muslim American community, and I had all types of clients from African American Muslims, South Asian Muslims, Arab Americans.
Excellent. Rami?
Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings. Also, I'd like to extend my gratitude to Abu Dhabi Gallup and Dalia and the New York University Institute here in Abu Dhabi for both this very important forum and this conversation and discussion. And I really appreciate your opening comments about the relevance still of the American Muslim narrative, even amidst this extraordinary moment in the region. And perhaps later we can talk about that. I am one that very passionately believes that there is still profound resonance between the American Muslim experience, its narrative, its global kind of circuits, if you will, even amidst these profound set of changes that are taking place in the region. I am the executive director of a nonprofit community organization that was founded in 1997 called Iman, the Inner City Muslim Action Network. On the outside, there's one of our more recent newsletters that you can pick up to get a sense of the breadth of our work. But essentially, Iman came into being as a organization that we started in the mid-90s, incorporated in 97 as a framework to bring together African American Muslims, Arab Muslims, Latino Muslims, a whole group of eclectic groups of Muslims, Southeast Asian, around a commitment to social justice issues in the inner city. Over the last 12, 13 years, the organization has grown, both to do, of course, a tremendous amount of work on the south side of Chicago, which is where we're based, but we also do work across the state and in some capacity work across the country. Our area, we focus in 3 areas. We have a range of direct services, a free community health clinic, programs for particularly African American Muslims and other Muslims who are coming home from prison and need stabilization, transitional housing, job training. We have services such as that. We do a lot of youth programming. We have a free health clinic, as I mentioned, that serves the larger population on the south side of Chicago, Latino, African American, Arab, Muslim, and non-Muslim. We do a lot of community organizing and advocacy. I mean, we are in the trenches working very actively with the Black church, Latino organizations, changing laws, introducing legislation to our state legislature, working around criminal justice reform, housing issues, education, public safety and violence. And then lastly, we do a lot of arts and culture programming. We have a pretty large arts and culture aspect of our work. We do very big festivals. One of our most well-known festivals in the United States is called Taking It to the Streets. It now brings over 17,000 people the last time we did it, with big major celebrities, again, all on the south side of Chicago, but we also have done things in venues like the Apollo in New York and in other places across the country. And then my academic interest, I'm a trained urban sociologist from the University of Chicago and teach an adjunct in a range of different colleges and universities, primarily on urban sociology classes. And I've always been, my dissertation was on the encounter of Islam in urban neighborhoods through hip hop and actually the emergence of kind of black street gangs. I've always been interested in the narratives that typically don't get a lot of media, that don't get a lot of press, and sometimes are a little more difficult to talk about, but are very essential to the larger American Muslim story in a city like Chicago.
Excellent. Now, I'm interested in engaging Dalia, because I think you were a liaison from the White House before you came here to the Muslim community, right?
Yes, I was a member of the White House Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, and the major mission of that group was to advise President Obama on how faith communities can best work with the federal government to solve societal problems like poverty, like fatherless families, and you know, Rami's work has always been a shining example of exactly that. I think, you know, just in listening to everyone talk here, it reflects, first of all, the diversity of the Muslim American community, but also some of the major challenges that they face. One being the diversity brings interactions that, you know, maybe didn't exist before, and there is real challenges around, you know, racial tension in our community in America. Another challenge is around discrimination, especially after 9/11, where there was a whole new dimension that we didn't have to deal with before that. And I think where Rami's work, what I want to really highlight, which he doesn't do very well, of course, because he's too humble, is Rami's work is a very good example of Muslim Americans coming to the platform and saying, we see a problem in American society in general, and we're going to help the community in general, everyone, not just Muslims. We're not here to only serve Muslims. We're here to serve humanity, and I think it's a wonderful example of that I think is growing, where Muslim Americans are seeing themselves as agents of change and people who belong to the community as a whole.
Excellent. Now, I wanted to engage you, Rami. I know that you had just been recognized by the White House in terms of the work that you've been doing in terms of civic engagement. What really struck me in the report was, and I'd like for you to respond to it, all of you, the lack of political engagement in terms of Muslims least likely to engage in the electoral process, while at the same time simultaneously respecting that process and recognizing and honoring it, but not really participating. So what would you, how would you respond to that?
Reconcile that tension?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, the interesting thing, and of course, I think this report's extraordinary, and it gives us, you know, those who are talking about this in the trenches, an opportunity to have some real data to marshal when we're in these arguments. As a more qualitative, kind of ethnographic type of person, of course, there are details that get left out of any type of more quantitative survey. And I think what gets left out is this, when you talk about political versus civic engagement. You know, there's of course, a larger history of extraordinary civic engagement of the American Muslim community and as you noted, primarily rooted in the Black experience. Some of the most phenomenal urban transformation programs are often not really talked about in the context of Islam too often, but I think about Kenny Gamble in South Philly, who over the last 25 years probably led the most radical transformation in any urban community. And of course, very openly Muslim, but integrated the larger non-Muslim community into that, was very civically and politically engaged. I think of people like Sophia Rubb in Baltimore. I think about the West End in Atlanta. There's extraordinary incidents across the country where Muslims have been very engaged civically, socially, and oftentimes it's a grassroots political engagement that I think sometimes is seen as distinct from politics from the top down. And what gets lost, I think, in a stat like that is when Muslims are when particularly over the last 10 years, it's been primarily immigrant Muslims who have been new to a lot of this, dominating the narrative. And I think sometimes their sense of politics is very much a top-down political approach. And I think there's still now a growing appreciation among immigrant Muslims, their children, as they engage more organically with the larger kind of indigenous experience about a much more grassroots politics, and politics that emerges from social services, engagement. And I think that is probably hard to capture in a survey, and perhaps may explain some of the difference there between, you know, reconcile that tension.
Jamillah, would you like to respond?
Yeah. Rami's comments remind me of my time doing research on relations between African American immigrant Muslims, and there's certainly tensions there. And African American Muslims would often speak to the fact that even though there have been many cases when immigrants have shown a sense of superiority towards African American Muslims, that they were very excited about this opportunity for immigrants to really look towards African American Muslims as a model for how to be citizens in this country. And 9/11 really inspired that turn towards the African American Muslim community. Because as he's noted, that African Americans and Muslims included have already been a part of a struggle for citizenship in the United States. And what I find really pleasing about the report, again, is this great optimism in the face of discrimination. Mm-hmm. And while that's very noteworthy, it really isn't that surprising when you look at the American dedication to this ideal of democracy. Even though the United States has come up short in many cases, nonetheless, our democratic ideals have put minorities in a position, it's really compelled minorities to fight for and engage their rights in the United States. And I think that no other group demonstrates that more clearly than African Americans. And I must share a poem that I came across. I've been teaching my nieces African American poetry, and I came across this Langston Hughes poem that, again, really captures this great hope and faith in the face of the harsh realities of racism for African Americans. And it's a poem called I Too, and he writes or wrote in the 1950s, I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be in the kitchen when company comes. Nobody will dare tell me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I, too, am America. And so I feel that this is the I Too moment for American Muslims.
Excellent. Now, I think something you said, and I wanted to kind of tease out a bit, this notion about some of the divisions and the chasm between immigrant and indigenous Muslims, African American Muslims, and the event of 9/11 created a kind of environment in which immigrant Muslims are now being subject to being under surveillance, profiled, oppressed, discriminated against, something that African Americans have, which has been part of the African American legacy in the United States. So it brought a kind of sensibility to the immigrant community in terms of what African Americans have been facing. But as you say, I think there's, as you were saying, Dalia, there's still a tremendous amount of challenges that must be overcome in order for those communities to bridge that chasm. I think is important. So tell us something about what you think about in terms of that.
So, what I love about the report is that it really captures this dual narrative, right? This idea that, over half of the Muslim American community feels that they are discriminated. And I think it is important to talk about that for a little bit, because I think that a lot of people outside of the US and even many people in the US really don't understand how extensive this discrimination, how from the top down, it's not just that the Muslim American community is getting it from the government, but they're also getting it from private individuals. And so, when I was a civil rights attorney in the US, I dealt with, things that all civil rights attorneys deal with, like employment discrimination, right? So there were basic issues about, wearing a beard or a hijab at work, right? To, really much more, if you can say more disturbing, the serious things where you actually had, this, we call them the network of Islamophobes, but you have this network of private individuals who feel that the government is not doing enough to marginalize Muslim Americans and are actually trying to use the legal system to harass, to bankrupt, to basically use a legal system to tap into the internal documents of Muslim organizations because they think they're going to find these secret documents that show the whole conspiracy. So, the Muslim community for the last 10 years has been under tremendous legal pressure, not just from, you talked about the FBI, and we haven't even begun to talk about the criminal issues, but So you have many private actors as well as government actors discriminating or harassing Muslims. And so I think it's really interesting that they have, you know, there's this other narrative of they're still hopeful, they still very much identify as being American. And I think the counter to that is, to the discrimination, is you see, I think, Muslim Americans who actually have faith in institutions in the US. You know, you talk about elections, but I think beyond that, the court systems. You know, you know, you have Muslim civil rights organizations, you know, sprouting up. You have Muslim advocates. You have, you know, legal defense funds coming up, which means that, you know, these are organizations that are aimed at raising money so they can finance the defense. You know, if they want to protect a mosque, right? I worked on a case where a group of Islamophobes essentially filed a lawsuit against a building of a mosque, claiming that it was going to be a nuisance. And, you know, usually when you talk about nuisances, you're talking about factories and smoke, or, you know, noise, or, you know, like a bar that has a lot of noise. And their claim was that this masjid was a nuisance because it was going to spread radical Islam. And, you know, these are really, really, you know, claims that are really out there. And these mosques have, you know, essentially they have to shell out the money to defend and build their mosques. And so it is interesting to see how you have Muslims, even in the face of all those challenges, you see you see them building their own civic institutions and trying to be part of the American narrative, which is really, you know, it's nice. It's wonderful that you're.
It's positive. Now, the other thing is when you think about the fact that historically there has been a tremendous amount of pressure on the Muslims since after the event of 9/11. And the Muslims have not gotten the kind of support from the traditional left in terms of intellectuals talking about the discrimination that goes on in the Muslim community. There's not much literature written by non-Muslims or people from other faith groups and others about what Muslims have actually gone through. And it's almost suffering in silence. Now, I remember at 9/11, well, first let's say this, the Oklahoma City bombing, or Timothy McVeigh, a kind of domestic terrorist. 200 Muslims were attacked as a result of that before they found out that it wasn't Muslims involved in that process. I remember very personally the experience of 9/11 as I looked out of my bedroom window looking at the towers burning. And what happened after that, after my wife received a death threat, I had to take my name off of my bell, because I lived near Ground Zero, to make sure that no one would attack us. And then going to the mailbox with gloves on and a face mask because the anthrax threat was in one of my post offices. But that was just a personal experience. I had been involved and engaged with Muslim leaders throughout the United States. And for the most part, most of my associates, particularly in the African American community, who are often speak out in a critique of America and what's going on in the Western world, are under surveillance, are stopped at airports, are not given opportunities to travel. I have just most of my imams, African American imams. I don't think this has even been chronicled. I know CARE, the Council on Islamic American Relations, has done some documentation, but I think that there needs to be much more information. And which leads me to this question around your response to the report. As we know, empirical social research often does not put a face, as you mentioned, to the sensibility and the texture of what's really happening to the Muslims in America. So do you feel that, I mean, talking to the Muslims and being engaged in the Muslim community in the United States, do you feel this sense of optimism? Because when I went to the United States, I didn't really feel this sense of optimism, nor did I felt because of the economic situation also, which we didn't even factor in, the level of poverty that exists, particularly within the African American community, is so pervasive that Muslims are really suffering financially and also being discriminated against. So how do you feel?
You know, it's interesting. I think two things, and I want to also back up to what you were just raising, because I think one very, fascinating finding here, and one that I think needs, you know, I think about both your policy recommendations that come out of this, but I also think about the undeveloped strategic recommendations here that have implications for both what I think Muslims across the world should be thinking about when they talk about interaction with American Muslims and American Islam, if you will, as well as for American Muslims themselves. And one thing, for instance, I think is the Jewish communities. To some people, surprising sensitivity to the range of issues affecting the Muslims. So you were mentioning, Amir, for instance, that there's not that much written or about from the larger non-Muslim about them, kind of the challenges and suffering. But I think also on the other side is, as expressed in this survey, is, you know, there have been some extraordinarily courageous voices in other faith communities that have taken very big risks publicly. I was at an event where a rabbi, I was asked to MC an event by one of the oldest civil rights, social justice action Jewish American entities in Chicago and perhaps the country. It's called the Jewish Council of Urban Affairs. Many rabbis, a lot of Jewish activists, both across the religious spectrum, Orthodox, Reform. When the keynote, who's a legend in Chicago, Rabbi Robert Marks, who marched with Martin Luther King in 1966 on the south side of Chicago, got up, and the first thing he said was, "I refuse to be happy in an America where American Muslims feel targeted." And this was at an event that was celebrating him and celebrating his legacy. And he got up and said, I don't want to celebrate tonight because of what's in his heart. And that is a common sentiment. So it's not surprising to see that. And I think I'm a Palestinian American, obviously, and I work very closely with the sector of the Jewish American community on social justice issues affecting communities, housing, criminal justice reform. And I think there are some unique opportunities for Muslim Americans and Jewish Americans to come together in some pretty profound ways that I think could affect the broader international discourse. On the question that you asked about the on-the-ground sentiment, I mean, America itself, right? Americans are often talked about as almost sometimes the naively optimistic kind of people, right? Kind of look at this notion of American optimism is sometimes theorists talk about part and parcel of this larger narrative about American exceptionalism. I mean, Americans can look disaster and challenges in the face and still be optimistic. And I do think that, yes, and in this, there is some racial disparities and I think some socioeconomic disparities among the harder hit, both African American as well as immigrant Muslim communities. I think there's a myth that there's an immigrant and an indigenous Islam that is synonymous with affluent suburbs and poor inner cities. But there are many immigrant Muslims that live and work in an area like on the south side of Chicago that in many ways share the same fate of African American Muslims on the south side of Chicago. And yeah, they probably have it harder and probably maybe less rosy about some of the kind of prospects like many of Americans about the economic dynamics. But I do think you will find, particularly among younger generations, both African American, second generation, a unique sense of optimism about what is possible. I think American Muslims are really encouraged about new spaces, new sets of connections that are being made, new opportunities, new organizations are popping up all the time, focusing on media, getting out of the kind of entrenched doctor, engineer framework. You have more and more Muslims in academia, in journalism, in media, in the arts, exploring, expressing. And I think all of that could translate on the ground into a sense of not rosy, naive optimism, but a sense of optimism. It's difficult, but there's possibility and we'll get beyond this. And I do think that a great degree of that is true.
Excellent. Would you say?
One thing I'd just like to add, when it comes to racial disparities or differences or socioeconomic differences along racial lines, in our first report in 2008, Muslim Americans, a National Portrait, that just looked at the demographics of the community, we found that when you look at the Muslim American community and you break it up by racial groups, there are some really strong differences. Okay, so African Americans are the least likely to be economically well off. South Asians are the most likely. So you look, Asians are the most rich, African Americans tend to be the most poor, and then everyone's in the middle. But when you then put America as a whole and break America up by its racial groups, it's exactly the same pattern. So the Muslim American community is simply a reflection of the American community, of America as a whole, and its problem with disparities along racial lines.
Interesting.
That's exactly what I write about in my
Go
book.
ahead. Talk about it.
And well, I first want to piggyback on Rami before I talk about that. And
Camelback.
Camelback.
Camelback, thank you, Camelback. Keep it halal. And I mean, what I found very promising about the report is that it demonstrated how our leaders have been very accurate and wise in the strategies that they're putting forth in terms of civic engagement in this country. And I thought about Dr. Umar Farouk Abdullah. And again, right after 9/11, he was telling his students that they must see Jewish Americans as allies in this country. And he also told them not to let their emotions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to hinder that. So he really told them to put that aside and, you know, again, to work on these relations. And of course, we know it has to do with the fact that Jews have always been integral in civil rights in the United States.
Right.
But what the poll further adds to Dr. Abdullah's his recommendations, it really shows that even when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict, that Jewish and Muslim Americans do have a lot in common. Again, the Gallup report showed that they feel similarly about the future, you know, what has to take place, the two-state solution in that region. So I just wanted to add that. And also Imam Dawidi Mohamed, that he had been working with a group called the Focalaire, a Catholic community, for years, and again, demonstrates their wisdom in really fostering those interfaith relations. Right?
Excellent.
Yes.
Angela?
You know, going back to the question you asked about optimism and whether or not, you know, we feel optimistic about the U.S., I think that it's hard to talk about the U.S., you know, in one gloss, right? There are different, you know, I've had experiences in the work that I've done where, you know, I worked on a case called the 6 Imams case, which was a case where there were 6 Imams that prayed in they were in Minnesota for an Imam conference, which is really, I don't know why I think that's funny, but, and 6 of them went to the airport and a few of them prayed in the airplane. And then after that, they got on the plane, they were kicked off the plane because it scared the passengers that they prayed, and they were subsequently arrested and then denied service afterwards. So, and I remember when we filed this lawsuit, it was probably the most difficult time in my professional life. We came under so much attack publicly because, you know, everyone was very afraid after September 11th, and, you know, the idea that, you know, how dare you sue the airlines for treating a Muslim this way? They might have just got scared and wanted to take them out, and that you're basically chilling. You're going to create a more unsafe environment by making people think twice before kicking Muslims off a plane. And I remember it got so bad that Congress even passed a law against our case to prevent us from raising a certain claim. I mean, that is a very exceptional circumstance, and it was very hard, but we had a judge. And I remember, you know, we did not know we were under so much pressure. We're a 2-lawyer firm. We're up against, you know, the U.S. Airways and, you know, the airport police. And we had a judge and one of the preliminary decisions that came out and really backed us. And like that, everything stopped. And, you know, to me, when you talk about optimism, you know, this idea that, yeah, and I know it doesn't work out every time. So, you know, I don't want to be this naive optimist, but also, you know, the system did work in that instance. And this judge did say, and the minute the judge said it, all of a sudden the reporters who were cursing us out in their articles were now coming to us and saying, oh, you know, judge claims that this is, you know, judge rules that this is, you know, potential discrimination. Having said that, so, you know, that makes you optimistic. But then there's this issue of the FBI, and I think we haven't talked about that yet,
Absolutely.
but I think it's really important to talk about it because
Definitely.
it is one of the most disturbing trends that that I see. And it's
Right.
not, again, I'm a lawyer.
So let's go around. This will be kind of our last round, and then we'll open the floor for discussions. But I think that there was really a telling stat in terms of Muslims and their well-being so connected with the notion of the FBI, because this is the apparatus of the U.S. government. So it's very important that we understand when we are querying people on the ground that are faith community, members of faith communities, that's different than dealing with the U.S. government and the apparatuses of the government. So what did you think about that? In terms of that relationship, what what has created that kind of tension between the community and the
Well,
FBI?
I think just to add to that a little bit, since we're bringing in the African American community, we actually did the same analysis on African Americans, just as a group, not Muslim African, but the African Americans in general, and found that their confidence in the police also was a significant driver of their well-being.
Okay.
So there are groups that have where certain law enforcement agencies play that kind of a strong part in their life and their ability to be happy and optimistic about their future.
Yeah.
It's a reality right now, and for the vast majority, those two agencies aren't even they're not things that people think about. They don't affect their well-being at all. I thought it was a very significant thing. Just
I think it's a
to
profound
uncover.
analogy. I mean, you take, I remember, just to juxtapose the two experiences, one of the heads of the local, the state Congress, CBC, Congressional Black Caucus. Remember him, we brought him to a black church. We were doing a big event on criminal justice reform and connecting immigration reform and criminal justice reform. And on the way, this guy's a pretty important person. On the way, he was stopped by the police. And he was in the midst of one of those classical, very dehumanizing, degrading interactions with primarily white police officers stopping a black man who was a very powerful black man that they did not know who he was until he got someone on the phone and they said, oh, it's our mistake. Can we give you an escort? But he talked about that in the context of relating to undocumented immigrants and their engagement also with another instrument of law enforcement in the United States, which at one point was the INS and now is also, Homeland Security. I do think, Dalia, you're absolutely correct, because one of those experiences, if he wasn't a powerful congressman, can totally tarnish the way in which a person like that experiences that feels about the country, about himself, about a sense of shame and dignity. And likewise, one American Muslim, and I had a friend, 19, 20-year-old, maybe like a year right after 9/11, he was one of the homes that the FBI came into because of some alleged thing, his older brother, some relationship with some person who was allegedly connected to some person, and subjected that entire household to 10, 12 hours of a interrogation at the house. Confiscated computers, confiscated everything. That affected this person profoundly, and could have this really just deep, lasting sense of how you feel about not just law enforcement, but yourself and the prospects. So I do think it's a good analogy, and I think American Muslims do continue to try to navigate this relationship with the FBI. Clearly, incidents over the last year have demonstrated that that's still a big issue. But what's amazing, I think, in your report, the Gallup report, is that I think American Muslims still see that, not unlike, I think, larger African Americans, are able to distinguish their treatment with the police from their larger sense of engagement with political civic institutions. And I do think that you have the same thing with Muslims. I don't think, and particularly now, in this administration, a lot of American Muslims would like to think that the leadership of President Obama and those directly with him are somewhat separate from the type of kind of engagement they get on a daily level from the FBI.
I see. Excellent. Who would like to respond to the issue? The question was the disconnect between the Muslim masses and the Muslim organizations. Another part of the question had to do with the question about the Jewish community and their support for lack of support for Muslim institutions. I think it's empowering Muslim institutions.
Let me just address the first one quickly. When we asked this question, it was an open-ended question. So we asked people, is there a Muslim organization that represents your views? And just asked them to tell us the name of one. There was one. And so the top one was about 12%, and that was CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations. and second came ISNA, which was about 7%. And I thought these numbers were quite low. Now, what we didn't do is we didn't ask Americans of other faiths to tell us if there was a national organization that represented their views when it came to their religious community. So we don't have any comparisons, which is not a good thing because we don't know what a high or low number is. But I'll just share one thing with you. We briefed the members of the White House on this report. And when they saw those numbers, they're like, wow, those are really high. I was like, are you serious? It's like 12%. It's like no national organizations really are, I mean, that's high for a national organization. So from the point of view of the government, they thought that was actually quite high. For an open-ended question, for 12% to actually just spontaneously say that name actually means that it's pretty high for national organizations. And what they were basically saying is that in general, national organizations don't tend to have the kind of grassroots effectiveness that they could. And so it's just sort of a function of when you're in Washington, you're trying to talk to the government, you're trying to engage, you don't have the effectiveness of a local church or a local mosque or a local community organization. But that said, so just that as a reference point, that said, there is still a chilling factor. I mean, there's no way to take that away. These organizations, especially in Washington, although outside of Washington I don't think it's as bad, in Washington have been made to be, people have made it, they've successfully made it so that people will think twice before, working for an organization like this because of all of the accusations that have been put out before them. I think that the thing that we should take away is if CARE and ISNA are indeed the most representative, even though it's quite low, but for a national organization as high as they kind of get, and they're also the two organizations that have been cited as unindicted co-conspirators in a terrorism case, then there is a problem. Because if you do have the most, quote, as low as it is still, the most legitimate national representatives with a barrier to engage the government, then you do have a marginalization problem.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you a question about your findings? Is it unusual for there to be several national organizations? Because I'm just trying to tie this in with your recommendation that you made to the government for them to keep track of discrimination stats. And I thought it was really interesting because for many other communities, marginalized communities, it's actually their national organizations that do the stats collection, right? And so I was just curious, is one of the reasons you directed the government to do it is because you didn't see there being... there are, Department of Justice and some other do actually track anti-Semitism and some other
anti-Christian activities globally.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And Muslim.
Yeah, and Muslim, but it's broken up into different agencies, so it's not all being collected. You're right, other groups do track their own, but we wanted it to be sort of an official number that the government would track and then act on. Yeah.
Would you respond to your husband's question?
I can respond to his question. The great intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois said that the problem of the 20th century is the color line in America, of course. And I still believe that race and racial boundaries throughout our society I still think that that's a major problem in our society today. And that's partly why I wrote a book about how race relations affect American Muslims. And as Dalia said so clearly, that the race relations in the American Ummah is indeed a reflection of those in the larger society, and particularly the way that our neighborhoods continue to be racialized. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I live in a predominantly African-American community. I go to an African-American mosque. I was teaching at an African-American college. And so it's very easy to be isolated in your own racial community. And this is still having devastating effects on our communities when it comes to poverty. In Atlanta, again, the majority of those in poverty are Black women and children. And so as a result of poverty, we're going to have issues when it comes to education. And then we find African Americans most African American men who are disproportionately incarcerated in our cities in the United States, which again relates to another host of problems around, again, strong family, strong communities. And so what I encourage American Muslims to do is that one way that they can really be a part of a solution in the United States, to really show other Americans that they care, is to be fully integrated into societies and to fully come to terms with those issues that are affecting our societies the most. And one way that you can be change agents could simply be by crossing those racial and ethnic boundaries. And that the American Muslim community, again, is in a very unique position to do that, because already our faith encourages us to create those bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood across these ethnic and racial lines. And we have these opportunities in our mosques, which are again racially and ethnically segregated, but we have these opportunities to visit a mosque across town. And by doing that, you are crossing those kinds of boundaries. And I really, I'm very passionate about this, and I think that even as Black American Muslims, we still have possibilities to engage not only with immigrants, but also with white Americans. And I think that in a lot of ways, we have failed to think about the ways that by crossing these boundaries, we can further teach and inform other Americans about about what it means to be a Muslim, right? So being engaged with your neighbor, whether they're African American, white American, etc.
I kind of have two questions, so I hope you can help me figure out what they are exactly. I'm a British Muslim. I'm also Black, and I'm also a woman. And my experiences of Islam, I believe, are very different to your experiences as American Muslims. I found that I never really faced any discrimination as a Muslim in the UK. I come to that. I faced a lot of discrimination being a woman, and I faced a lot of discrimination being Black, but often people didn't realize I was Black. I got confused with other things. But generally speaking, my experiences with discrimination are different. So, my question is sort of twofold. My first question is, have you looked into, have you asked any questions, have you learned from any other Western Muslims, their experiences in England, the UK, in Europe? And my second question actually goes to Jamillah in terms of this experience of discrimination. I noticed you said racial and religious, and I believe from my experiences, there's a big difference between racial discrimination and religious discrimination. Mm-hmm. Was your question very, I said Jamillah, but I believe that you did some research into African American Muslims and immigrant Muslims, and you still had answered questions. Do you not think maybe there's a difference in how people experience and would explain and describe discrimination? Are my questions clear? Mm-hmm. Sorry.
Yes. Dalia, would you like to respond?
Well, I think there's several questions here. I'll start with, the idea of a dichotomy between Islam in the West or Muslims in the West, where there are millions of Muslims that are also Western, and I think that it's something. This dichotomy comes out of a very specific narrative around a distinction between the two. And I do think Western Muslims have a very important role to play to show the fallacy of this dichotomy. And I'd add to that, one thing that I would recommend as someone who's been studying this and working on it for several years is for within our own community as Muslim Americans, I'm going to talk for a second as a Muslim American, for us to even move beyond to address that very idea of this lack of a dichotomy, for us to look at our own community as being made up of African, Arab, Asian, American Muslims, instead of the dichotomy of immigrant, indigenous. The reason I say that is because immigrants are still immigrants, even if they've been, they were born there, they're second generation, and we fall very much into you're only an American if you fall into two different sort of color lines, and you're an immigrant forever. And it comes out of the Islam versus the West dichotomy, interestingly. So I think we can actually contribute to moving beyond that by changing our own language within our own community. And then I just want to quickly say that we do study other Western Muslims, British, French, and German Muslims. And I agree with you, racial and religious discrimination aren't the same thing. And we have looked at how African Americans answer that question. What we wanted to do is be able to compare. So we didn't want to just say religious discrimination or racial. And we felt that we were safe enough that although there's both. And the thing is, we were also cognizant of the fact that you actually don't know sometimes exactly why you're being discriminated against. Is it because you're Muslim, because you're Arab, because of your ethnicity? It's all kind of melded together. It's because of who you are, but you feel like it's because of something about the way I look that I'm not getting service or I'm not getting a job or whatever. So we also wanted to be cognizant of the fact that it's not clear to the person always what it is about their ethnicity that is causing the discrimination. So we did ask both of them together. We compared it to how general public African Americans and Hispanic Americans answer that question, and they're very similar. So Muslim Americans, their perception of their discrimination is very similar to African Americans in general in America.
I would, so the first question, Tamu's question about this kind of unnerving dichotomy that seems, particularly now, so mid-early 20th century, when you go across the globe, I mean, how can anyone really seriously talk about the world that way anymore? When we're in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Beyonce, I think, was here last year, Jay-Z was here, how can we talk about Abu Dhabi or this part of the world as somehow isolated from a quote-unquote Western set of both technological, cultural influences, whatever that means. So I think part of that is really, the absurdity of not acknowledging that we live in this extraordinarily globally interconnected world where West-East dichotomies no longer even work. Secondly, though, I think Tamoud also points back to why I think the American Muslim narrative is still such an important one, and I don't mean to be American-centric here, but I still think the American Muslim narrative is really critical. It's really relevant for Muslims in this part of the world and others who are engaged seriously with this part of the world, as well as I think European Muslims, and I'd like to speak to that for a second. I think we've been talking a lot about race. I think both America's challenge about the color line is also what makes the American Muslim experience so unique. No other Western Muslim experience has both the kind of challenge as well as the privilege of a historically anchored narrative as part of America. There's no way that anyone can say part of the American narrative is deeply rooted also and interwoven into the larger African American and Muslim narrative there. I mean, and that's increasingly come out in scholarship. Alan Austin, Sylvia Ndoyouf, about the encounter of Islam in America goes very deep. I've always encouraged Muslims of all backgrounds to embrace that as part of our larger history, meaning get beyond sectarian philosophical things. The Nation of Islam had a tremendous effect on my ability to think about myself as Muslim in America. And I don't ever think I should apologize for me thinking about the nation and whether it's those set of experiences as having a profound impact on even children of immigrants' sense of what being a Muslim means. And so I think when you think about that American Muslim narrative, in part what you're thinking about is Islam as a force of transformation, helping America historically to live up to some of its more unfulfilled ideals and principles. I think American Muslims think about their religion and their citizenship in those very idealistic ways sometimes, that Islam, like other forces in the United States, that has helped America, to challenged America to live up to some of its more unfulfilled ideals. I think American Muslims have historically saw their role as helping to reconcile some of these extraordinary ethnic racial segregations that characterize life in America, and certainly have characterized life for American Muslims. I think what makes it unique in the American Muslim context is American Muslims do obsess about this issue. We talk about it, we think about it, we're debating it, we're challenging it. We don't accept by proxy the idea that there should be a one side of town or another side of town. And I think that is something of contribution to Muslims across the world when they think about the relevance of American Muslim identity in shaping civic society in such profound ways.
Excellent.
Can I?
Yes,
No. I think it's related, but it actually responds to the question about the denouncing of terrorism. Because I'm curious, and Dalia, I'm curious to know a bit more about the questions that you asked. And when you have such a high percentage of Americans saying that they think that Muslims aren't doing enough to denounce terrorism, I am not sure that it means that they've never heard a Muslim denounce terrorism. I'm curious to know, whether it's that they don't believe Muslims when they say that they don't support terrorism. And I think one of the ways, because all these organizations, all these Muslim American organizations, like on their websites, it's just like it's like a permanent strip on their websites, like see our statement denouncing terrorism. So I don't know if it's that Americans haven't heard them denounce it. I think it's that they might not trust Muslims, and I think that the kind of community work that Rami, the work that Rami is doing about, when you become part of the American fabric, right? I think that is where when people can identify with you, when people have a connection with you past this kind of abstract discussion about terrorism, people will start to. I think, that this is my hypothesis, they will then accept that denunciation of terrorism. And so, there's been all types of really amazing, and, the 30 mosques in 30 days of Ramadan, there are these projects where, people will use the web to post, reflections on Ramadan. And I think, then a lot of people who don't know anything about Muslims, or, it's these types of things that I think build that trust, and I think only then will people start to think that.
Well, I think the time has come to an end. I'd like to just say this, that I think while we do take solace in the fact that the report reflects a great sense of optimism that is reflective of the kind of ethos of the American people, I must also counsel about the reality, as my wife asked about the idea of the East versus West and the dichotomy, that we have become dichotomized. Now, what we have to also accept is what we call the meta-narrative in the Western world that dichotomizes Islam in the West. If one looks at what is happening in Europe with the banning of the hijab in schools, if one looks at what happens in Europe about the idea of no more mosques, no more minarets, no mosque in 9/11, in Ground Zero, we have to accept the reality that on the ground, there are apparatuses of state, tremendous anxieties that exist within the world, within the Western world, about Islam and the Muslim project and the potential for terrorism and the threat that often is more perceived than real, but still nonetheless real. So that, I think, brings us to the point where we have to work harder to build bridges of understanding and communication and education among us as a people, that we embrace difference as opposed to just accepting and being tolerant, but that we embrace and celebrate difference so that we create another world. And I see that finally that is emanating throughout the Arab Spring and everything that's going on with the young people, with the next generation throughout the world. Thank you very much for being such a patient audience. Thank you, presenters, for this wonderful program. On behalf of the Institute again and the Gallup Center, I would like to thank you. There are programs, studies available for you, and also the Institute has been kind enough to provide food for us. Am I right on that? Thank you very much, and good night.